All right, so we are looking at our third day today, the respiratory system physiology and anatomy and stuff. And so, um, oh, we don't have any overview slides. Uh, well, I'll do a little, a little bit of our objectives today, our learning objectives. We really want to understand a little bit about what we mean when we say pulmonary ventilation. That's the process of actually just like breathing. Right? You have to contract certain muscles that open up your lungs and draw gas in. And then your body's going to filter out the gases that we need. Most of our atmosphere is not oxygen. Actually, most of our atmosphere is nitrogen. Actually, not a very small, but like a relatively small percentage of it is oxygen, and that's the main thing that we need to breathe. So luckily your lungs act as a pretty good filter, similar to your digestive system. We'll work our way through understanding a little bit about like the anatomy of our lungs and how they function. And then we'll talk about a little bit about diffusion today. And we're going to be spending a ton of time understanding pressure, which is really handy because tomorrow we're going to get into the cardiovascular system, where we'll be talking about the heart and how it pumps blood around the body. And that also very much relies on pressure. So we're going to get a pretty good understanding of how pressure works and how it drives things from one area to another, and how that's responsible for driving oxygen not only into our lungs but also into our blood cells. And then we'll kind of finish everything up by talking a little bit about how that's carried by our blood cells, which will sort of pivot us into tomorrow's lesson on the cardiovascular system, because your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system work so intimately together that we often just refer to both of them as the cardiorespiratory system, where it's kind of putting those two separate systems together. Also, if we are talking about, just to kind of introduce it, we are going to be watching a little bit of a crash course video today. It is on the cardiorespiratory system. So we're actually only going to watch about half of the video today. And then once they get to the cardiovascular part of it, I'll pause it and we can pick that up tomorrow. But I do want to start with that actually, because it's a really good way for you guys to see some animations and sort of visualize all this stuff, because that's the one thing that's kind of hard about studying anatomy and physiology, right? It's kind of easy to be like, all right, this is a squat and this is what a good squat looks like, and you can actually do it and be like, oh, I should keep my chest up more, like it's easy when you see it. But like when I say that there are little bronchioles that are covered in blood vessels, it's always like, what does that kind of look like? Like I can't hold the inside of my lungs, so it's kind of nice to start with the animation so you get an idea of sort of what this stuff sort of looks like. There we go.
Hey Ted, Janet, what are you up to?
Oh, just taking pictures of the house.
That's a bit old-fashioned, isn't it?
Oh, I forgot. This is the weirdest intro he does.
All members of the kingdom Animalia need oxygen to make energy. Oxygen is compulsory. Without oxygen, we die. But as you know, the byproduct of the process that keeps us all alive, cellular respiration, is carbon dioxide, or CO2, and it doesn't do our bodies a bit of good. So not only do we need to take in the oxygen, we also got to get rid of the CO2. And that's why we have the respiratory and circulatory systems to bring in oxygen from the air with our lungs, circulate it to all of our cells with our heart and arteries, and collect the CO2 that we don't need with our veins and dispose of it with the lungs when we exhale. Now, when you think of the respiratory system, the first thing that you probably think of is the lungs. But some animals can take in oxygen without lungs by a process called simple diffusion, which allows gases to move into and pass through wet membranes. For instance, arthropods have little pores all over their bodies that just sort of let oxygen wander into their body where it's absorbed by special respiratory structures. Amphibians can take in oxygen through their skin, although they also have their lungs or gills to help them respire, because getting all your oxygen by way of diffusion takes freaking forever. So why do we have to have these stupid lung things instead of just using simple diffusion? Well, a couple of reasons. For starter, the bigger the animal, the more oxygen it needs, and a lot of mammals are pretty big. So we have to actively force air into our lungs in order to get enough oxygen to run our bodies. Also, mammals and birds are warm-blooded, which means that they have to regulate their body temperatures, and that takes many, many calories, and burning those calories requires lots of oxygen. Finally, in order for oxygen to pass through a membrane, the membrane has to be wet. So for a newt to take oxygen in through its skin, the skin has to be moist all the time, which, for a newt isn't a big deal, but, I don't particularly want to be constantly moist. Do you? Fish need oxygen too, of course, but they absorb oxygen that's already dissolved in the water through their gills. If you've ever seen a fish gill, you'll remember that they're just sort of a bunch of filaments of tissue layered together. This gill tissue extracts dissolved oxygen and excretes the carbon dioxide. Still, there are some fish that have lungs, like lungfish, which we call lungfish because they have lungs, and that's actually where lungs first appeared in the animal kingdom. All animals from reptiles on up respire with lungs deep in their bodies, basically right behind the heart. So while us more complex animals can't use diffusion to get oxygen directly, our lungs can. Lungs are chock full of oxygen-dissolving membranes that are kept moist with mucus. Moist with mucus. Another great band name. The key to these bad boys is that lungs have a ton of surface area, so they can absorb a lot of oxygen at once. You wouldn't know from looking at them, but human lungs contain about 75 square meters of oxygen-dissolving membrane. That's bigger than the roof of my house. And the simple diffusion that your lungs use is pretty frickin' simple. You and I breathe oxygen in through our nose and mouth. It passes down a pipe called your larynx, which then splits off from your esophagus and turns into your trachea, which then branches to form two bronchi, one of which goes into each lung. These bronchi branch off again, forming narrower and narrower tubes called bronchioles. These bronchioles eventually end in tiny sacs called alveoli. Each alveolus is about 1/5 of a millimeter in diameter, but each of us has about 300 million of them, and this, friends, is where the magic happens. Alveoli are little bags of thin, moist membranes, and they're totally covered in tiny, narrow, blood-carrying capillaries. Oxygen dissolves through the membrane and is absorbed by the blood in these capillaries, which then goes off through the circulatory system to make cells all over your body happy and healthy. But while the alveoli are handing over the oxygen, the capillaries are switching it out for carbon dioxide that the circulatory system just picked up from all over the body. So the alveoli and capillaries basically just swap one gas for another. From there, the alveoli takes that CO2 and squeezes it out through the bronchioles, the bronchi, the trachea, finally out of your nose and or mouth. So inhale for me once. Congratulations, oxygen is now in your bloodstream. Now exhale. Wonderful, the CO2 has now left the building and you don't even have to think about it, so you could think about something more important, like how many Cheetos you could realistically fit into your mouth at the same time. So now you're all, yeah, that's great, Hank, but how do lungs actually work? How do they do the thing where they get moved to come in and out and stuff? Well, eloquent question, well asked. Lungs work like a pump, but they don't actually have any muscles in them that cause them to contract and expand. For that, we have this big flat layer of muscles that sits right underneath the lungs called the thoracic diaphragm. At the end of an exhalation, your diaphragm is relaxed. So picture an arc pushing up on the bottom of your lungs and crowding them out so that they don't have very much volume. But when you breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and flattens out, allowing the lungs to open up. And as we know from physics, as the volume of a container grows larger, the pressure inside it goes down. And the fluids, including air, always flow down their pressure gradient from high pressure to low pressure. So as the pressure in our lungs goes down, air flows into them. When the diaphragm relaxes, the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the air outside, and the deoxygenated air rushes out. And that is breathing. Now, it just so happens that the circulatory system works on a pumping mechanism just like the respiratory system, except instead of moving air into and out of the lungs, it moves blood into and out of the lungs. The circulatory system moves oxygenated blood out of the lungs to the places in your body that needs it, and then brings the deoxygenated blood back to your lungs. And maybe you're thinking, well, what about the heart? Isn't the heart the whole point of the circulatory system? Well, settle down. I'm going to explain. We're used to talking about—
You'll explain tomorrow. All right. Not now, Hank. We'll come back to you. All right, before we move any further, I have one question. Edwin, are you snowboarding right now?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Because I know sometimes, what's that?
I was just getting coffee. I don't know if you asked the question. I was making coffee. I went to get it.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I was checking the weather this morning and I was like, I gotta ask my resident expert.
I don't even know what Mammoth.
Because it looks like, Bear Mountain got a little bit.
It's been hot. It's been like 40. I went yesterday. It was like 50. That's why I did the afternoon class. It was like 50.
Woo. That's too warm. I will say it's kind of nice sometimes though. I love snowboarding in a long sleeve just t-shirt,
Yeah, it was nice.
But it's also very icy. All right. So you got to see a little bit of the animations that'll help you understand a little bit more about how we are going to be moving air into and out of our lungs. One of the things that I am going to say right now that is very helpful, one of my favorite things about teaching anatomy classes is that I get to also kind of just say broad things about the universe we all live in, which I think is kind of fun. Here's something to remember, guys. In general, if you want to understand a little bit more about how the universe we live in works just a little bit, and you want to understand it just a little bit better, one thing to keep in mind that explains a whole lot of stuff just kind of naturally, remember this: nature hates gradients. Nature does not like it when there is a lot of stuff over there and very little stuff over there. What nature wants to do, it naturally wants to even everything out. It's like, oh, there's a lot of stuff over here. Take some of that, put it over there, but not too much. I want it level, So if you add something like this, that's sort of it's the kind of your classic triangle, right? This is sort of the perfect example of a gradient. Okay, so if you had stuff here, like a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here, what's going to happen is nature is going to naturally push stuff from here. Oof, good Lord, that was not supposed to be a straight line. From here over here, right? Is literally going to naturally, even if you put like a wall in the way, right? Like if you had a wall separating this, and instead of drawing random squiggles, we'll put like a little wall here, right? And let's say you've got a whole bunch of stuff over here. We're going to put a high concentration of stuff over here, right? And we'll put a low concentration of stuff over here. So what would happen naturally, even though there's a wall, as long as that wall isn't like perfectly solid, if there are any holes in that wall for stuff to squeeze through, what will happen naturally is stuff will move that way, until the concentration is equal on both sides, right? Until eventually the triangle isn't really a gradient anymore. Now instead, it kind of looks like, this, where it's like an even amount, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm not trying to make any broad political statements here, but nature is very much a socialist. It wants everybody to be equal and even and have the same amount of money. Like, it wants everything to be nice and level, right? So it wouldn't really be a triangle anymore. It would kind of be, just a simple rectangle. At least in terms of concentrations. So that is one of the reasons why our lungs are able to take in so much oxygen into our bloodstream, right? Like when you listen to the video we just talked about, right? He talked about how, there are amphibians here in the world who take in oxygen through, in that process of moving through a wall, we call that diffusion, right? It's diffusing from one place to another. There are animals that take in oxygen through their skin. They diffuse it straight through the atmosphere into their skin, and it just kind of, allows them to kind of get the oxygen in that they need. So, you might be thinking, well, why don't we do that? And one of the things he said And the video is like, well, we're very much larger than those animals. This is actually one of the reasons why dinosaurs really can't be around in our world anymore. The atmosphere composition is very different now than it was, you know, millions of years ago. And so, you know, that's part of why it's like, you know, lizards are so small now. And it's like, I watched, you know, Jurassic Park just a couple of weeks ago. And it's like, those are really big lizards. How the heck do we not have any of those anymore? Well, one part of the reason, like, you know, yeah, they got hit by a meteor and all that. But another big part of the things is that our atmosphere rapidly changed, and it really wouldn't support an animal with that anatomy anymore. That's also why, you know, if you ever, you know, we used to talk about dinosaurs back in the day, but like, you ever see like prehistoric bugs? Good Lord. Insects. Prehistoric bugs were huge. Like, imagine dealing with like a grasshopper, you know, bigger than you. Like, you know, look at that freaking, I don't know what it looks like a thing. You know, imagine that. Oh my God, it's a bee. Oh God. I'm so, what's that?
Bugs are as small as they are due to less oxygen in the earth, no?
Exactly. So there's not as much oxygen in our atmosphere. So it was, you know, and most insects diffuse air straight through their membrane. So they wouldn't really be able to survive. Now, that being said, the biggest insect in the world that's still around is this little frickin' grasshopper here that's found in New Zealand. That is holding a full-sized carrot. It's kind of cute with those little eyeballs and stuff, but man, that is just massive.
If insects were our size, it'd be over for us, man. There's no way we'd be able to keep them.
Well, luckily they wouldn't be able to breathe, so we'd probably be able to outrun them.
Probably.
So they have to take in oxygen by letting it simply move, kind of like the drawing we just made, from an area of high concentration, like the atmosphere, to an area of low concentration, like inside their body. So nature goes, there's not as much oxygen there, and there's a lot of oxygen there. And so it drives it naturally through their skin into their body. But the concentration of oxygen in our atmosphere now is much lower. So there isn't as big of a gradient, right? Like the difference between, there used to be a lot of oxygen here, very little oxygen here. So now it's like this. So because of that, it isn't a very good way to breathe. It doesn't drive in very much oxygen. You need to have something that also creates a little bit pressure. For instance, having like a little balloon that only expands so far. And when it can't expand any further, you know what that does? That creates a really high concentration. And then all of a sudden, oxygen's like stuck in this balloon. It's like, I gotta go somewhere. And it goes into our bloodstream. And that is why your lungs are so important. And that's why we moved from bringing oxygen in simply, you know, from out here straight through our skin. We moved to draw it inside our body because it creates an area of higher concentration, which creates a bigger gradient. Lots of stuff, very little stuff. And so then that gradient naturally nature kind of wants to work against that, because nature hates gradients. Get that tattooed. It'll help you understand the universe just a little bit better. Whenever you're like, how the heck does that chemical attach to that chemical? A lot of times it's because of a gradient. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about what we mean when we say pulmonary ventilation. So pulmonary ventilation is the process of actually breathing. That's sort of if we're being fancy and we're laying it out in scientific terms, pulmonary ventilation is breathing, right? Pulmonary, you know, that's where we're talking about our lungs. Ventilation is moving gases from one place to another. So this is where we are moving gas into our lungs, right? Pulmonary ventilation. So the primary, you know, job here, the primary function, is to create a really intense concentration of oxygen molecules so that it will naturally want to move into our bloodstream. Well, how is it going to do that? Well, it's going to work really intimately with our cardiovascular or circulatory system, right? Now, your cardiovascular system doesn't actually extract any oxygen from the atmosphere. That's not really its job. But what it does do is it carries it around our body. You know, that's your blood's whole deal, is that it moves oxygen around the body. And we have these really cool little cells called red blood cells. They're known as erythrocytes in their, you know, big old fancy name. And, you know, I know that I talk about donuts a lot in the last couple of days, but they kind of look like a filled in donut, you know, like they're a little thicker along the outside edge, a little thinner on the middle, and that serves a double purpose. Actually, there we go. You can see there's sort of a side view there. Serves a sort of a double purpose here, because number one, by having that shape, you can kind of hold stuff in the little, you know, little area, right? Like something can kind of sit in there and hold. And then also, what's kind of cool is, you know, if you had something like that, imagine if you had something like this made out of rubber and you tried to squeeze it from end to end, it would fold really easily. Right? Like you'd have no hard time. You know, when something's thinner in the middle, it just makes it very good at folding. Let me see if I can find a picture of a folded little red blood cell squeezing through a capillary. I can never find the pictures I want. But just picture one of those kind of folded in half. I have no idea how I would draw that. But wait, folding through capillary. Let's see if we can find that. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you can kind of see it there, right? So they can actually kind of fold really easily, and that allows them to squeeze through your capillaries, right? Your capillaries are little blood vessels, you know. If you've ever gotten a bruise and, you know, you see like a big, you know, purple mark on your leg or your arm or whatever, right? That bruise is because you basically popped some of the capillaries. These capillaries are so small that it's pretty easy to break them, you know. And so when you break them, they start leaking blood into the area, and you start to see that blood pool under your skin, and that's what a bruise is, right? So, oh, we got Gabriel joining us. Hold on just one second. Let him in here. Wait for it. Hey, what's up, man? Welcome back.
What's up? What's up?
Good to have you. Okay, so so like I said, red blood cells are really good at squeezing through these little holes. So here's a fun fact. Your red blood cells are some of the smallest cells in your entire body. They are really tiny compared with like some of your other cells, you know? And here's what's also cool. Your capillaries, the little blood vessels, they are sometimes smaller than the red blood cell. Now that seems kind of weird because you're like, what? Wait, why would the tube that the thing travels through be smaller than the thing traveling through it? Well, picture a little red blood cell, right? Picture a little red blood cell. There we go. Finally got a picture I really love. So it's going through like a really small tube like this, right? So this is 8, you know, micrometers across, and this is 5, right? So, you know, it doesn't really fit very well. So it gets stuck on the tube, and it gets stuck there for just a second, and you got a lot of water in your blood, you got a lot of, you know, plasma and fluids and stuff. So what ends up happening is a pressure starts to build up, and then eventually shoves it through, and it goes flying through there. And that is part of how blood pressure actually works, and we'll be talking way more about that tomorrow. But what's really cool about that is that shoves it into our lungs, and that is one of the other reasons why oxygen is going to move from an area of high concentration in the chamber that is your lungs to an area of low concentration inside these little red blood cells. So that is thanks to, we call that capillary pressure. And thanks to that capillary pressure, that's one of the ways that we are actually much better at extracting oxygen, you know, with using lungs rather than just kind of passively bringing it through our skin and kind of exposing it to our blood, you know. Like even if you were to, you know, cut your arm and stuff, and obviously you would see your blood and it's bright red because there's a lot of oxygen there. Yes, the reason it's bright red is, you know, there's a lot of air being exposed to that red blood cell, but not as much of it would actually drive into your blood cells as it would if it were actually inside your lungs. And that's kind of fun to think about without thinking about it too graphically. So your cardiorespiratory system, that is what we are going to spend the next 2 days talking about, right? Like I said, exercise physiology, this whole course, it's all about understanding how we are able to gather and use energy, right? This is the energy production course, right? And so we started yesterday with the digestive system, and today we're looking at the oxygen, because when you put glucose and oxygen together, you get a ton of energy. So we also need to understand how we're going to deliver that stuff. And that's where the cardiovascular / circulatory system comes in. So your cardiorespiratory system, its basic purpose is to deliver oxygen to the mitochondria of our cells, right? The idea here of the cardiorespiratory system is that we are extracting oxygen from the environment so that we can get it to our, right pinky toe. Like all the cells really far away, we got to be able to get oxygen into every one of our cells so that our cells can survive, right? Your brain needs so much oxygen in order to create all the energy necessary to have thoughts and actions and stuff. Your muscles, holy cow, they need a ton of oxygen. I get to play Ultimate for the first time today in a couple weeks, and I'm so excited, but I'm going to need a lot of oxygen in order to do it. And I'm probably going to be very out of breath here in the new year. And that is a big part of why we need it, right? The reason I'm going to start picking up my breath, the more I start running and the more I start spinning, the faster I go, right? David, I'm sure you experienced the same thing this morning, right? You were fine. You weren't really breathing all that hard. And then all of a sudden you start breathing really hard. And then, you're going up a hill and you start really peaking and you're like, right? The reason you are breathing harder is because your cells are like, hey, we need it. You want energy in order to run that gluteus maximus muscle. You want energy to run those calves. I need oxygen and I need glucose, right? And that'll become clear as we kind of move through the rest of this course. But right now, we're finishing up our sort of ingredients for energy, right? We talked about gathering the glucose yesterday. Today, we're talking about gathering the oxygen. So the respiratory system gathers it, the cardiovascular system delivers it. So talking about what your lungs are. Your lungs are a really cool piece of anatomy. They're basically these empty, sort of sac-like structures. They're kind of like big empty paper sacks, right? If or like a bag or something like that, right? Like imagine if you had like a bag and you grab the edges of it and you draw it open like that, right? What would happen? Air would go rushing in. And the reason air would go rushing in is because nature hates gradients. Oh, we lost somebody. Again, nature does not like it when there is a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here. Nature will naturally want to move it from one spot to the other. So if there is a lot of gas in my room right now, which there is, there's atmosphere here in my room, and I draw my lungs open, I grab a sack and I pull it open like that, all of the gas from my room is going to go rushing in there because there was no gas. I got this big empty chamber that has nothing in it, and nature goes, gross, and it moves it in there naturally, right? And that is, again, that's an example of pressure moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So your lungs are these empty, which, low concentration because they're empty, sac-like structures that are able to house the conducting parts of your respiratory system. When I say conducting, what do I mean? Like if you were conducting somebody, you'd be telling them where to go, right? The conductor in an orchestra is like, do this. I have no idea how conductors work, but they all stick. I know that much. They look like they're casting spells. But like a conductor would be like, you got to go here, you got to go here, you got to go here, right? The conducting part of your lungs, they're little tubes that send oxygen into smaller and smaller branches where they need to go until they eventually get to being exposed to your blood. So that's why we call it the conducting parts of your lungs. And so inside your lungs are what are known as bronchi. And you can see each lung has these two primary bronchi. And bronchi are these large tubes that conduct oxygen further into the lung. So if you look at this picture here, you can see, right, here's his trachea. The trachea is this tube that, it's made of cartilage. It's kind of hard, but it's not as hard as like bone is, which is kind of nice because that allows it to be very flexible. We can move our necks around and stuff without it really closing up. If it were like a hard tube, it would either break, which would be real bad. And if it were too soft, it would get pinched close. And we don't want that because then every time you look to your right, you're like, oh, I can't breathe. So luckily it's made out of cartilage, which makes it pretty flexible, but also remains open when it needs to. So that is going to drive oxygen in through the mouth, and it's going to pass down the trachea. And then the trachea is going to split into two different sections here. Those are your primary bronchi. They're called the primary bronchi because those are the first two kind of main ones, right? And then that is going to branch into smaller sections and smaller bronchi until eventually they get really, 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 really small. I don't know if anybody here, again, I cannot draw to save my life, but I do remember when I was a kid, my grandma trying to teach me, she's like a really good artist, tried to teach me how to draw trees. You would go like this, you draw the trunk of the tree, and then like she would always go, well, you gotta start, you gotta bring it in thinner, and then you gotta make branches, right? So a branch kind of comes out and you draw it up here, and then what do you do to continue making branches, right? You make it, you make it a little smaller, you branch it again, you create a smaller branch over here, and then it gets smaller. Oh, grandma. I did not learn how to keep drawing, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Until eventually, you get these little tiny branches. Well, that is exactly how your lungs work. You notice it starts with your primary bronchi, which are these really big tubes, and then it gets a little bit smaller, and it branches off smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually it gets microscopic. It gets so small that you can't see it with your naked eyeballs, right? You have to zoom in really far, and there is what we call a bronchiole. A bronchiole is just a really, really, really small bronchi. Right. So you get your primary bronchi, and then it becomes your regular bronchi, and then you get your bronchioles. And then by that point, it's really, really, really tiny. Now, those bronchi, okay, so bronchi are little large tubes, and they branch smaller and smaller until they are considered bronchioles. Bronchioles are microscopic branches of the bronchi. Now, each of those bronchi end in these little, they kind of look like popcorn, right? These little popcorn shaped sacs here. And those little popcorn shaped sacs are absolutely covered in blood vessels. Okay. Those little popcorn shaped sacs, those are called your alveoli, or alveoli, I think is how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. But they're little microscopic popcorn shaped sacs. And like I said, they're covered in blood vessels. Like, look at this little capillary bed here, right? Look at all these little tiny blood vessels that are covering it. Now, they're drawing it the way that we always draw blood vessels when we're drawing anatomy. So you can see here, we got the blue section over on this side, and we got the red section over here. You got the blue ones and the red ones. We only draw it that way to make it easier to understand. I'm going to say this right now, just so everybody knows, you do not ever have blue blood, ever. Your blood is either really dark red, and it kind of looks bluish under your skin, or you got bright red blood, and it looks bright red. You never have blue blood. that is sort of a myth, even if you are a police officer.
Oh man, I thought Avatar was real.
I know, right? It's kind of a bummer, right? For the record, later today, I will explain which creatures do have blue blood. It's one of my favorite weird fun facts for you guys. But we'll talk about why your blood is red just later today. But what that means, the reason we draw it in blue is because we consider that to be deoxygenated blood. So if you've ever, when you guys go take CPR, because everybody in here is going to have to get CPR, one of the things they're going to teach you is if you come upon a person who is not breathing, right? First thing, always check to see, if what caused them to stop breathing is around the area, like a power pole or, something like that down. Always check that first and make sure and then check to see if they are actually conscious. So you're going to slap them and be like, where are you? That's not what you're going to do. But you do want to check to make sure that like you're not doing CPR on someone who's taking a nap at the beach. And then one of the things you're going to check for is you're going to look to see if their lips are blue. Your lips are actually a really high blood flow area. That's one of the things that makes kissing so pleasant. They're really high blood flow area, so they get a little puffy. And when you do not have any oxygen running through your body, they will start to turn a bluish color. That's one of the ways you can tell if someone is suffocating. And it's because the red blood cells are turning a dark, dark, dark red color because they've given up all of their oxygen. And the only thing that's left in those blood cells is carbon dioxide, the waste product of cellular energy production. So now all that's left is waste product. So the blood is dark, 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 dark red, you know? So then you need to do CPR on that person, right? So that's why we draw it in this color here. You can see what the dark blue section is. That's deoxygenated blood is what we call it. It means that it has some CO2 in it. It's still blood cells, but it doesn't have very much oxygen. That's why it's not a bright red color. So that means that this section, the blue section, just showed up at the lungs. It just went to the heart, and then the heart shoved it over to the lungs, and now it just got here, and it's here so that it can get rid of all of its CO2. It's like, hey, I got all this waste. I need you to take this. And so it drops off all of its CO2 at the lungs. And then that blood cell can kind of keep working its way over here, and it can get to the oxygenation station where oxygen molecules are going to rush into that red blood cell, and whew, it's going to turn into a bright red color. And now that red blood cell has a ton of oxygen in it. So then it gets sucked back to the heart so that it can get delivered to, you know, your right pinky toe. So that is how we pump stuff around, right? Blood cells will deliver oxygen, you know, oh no, David, you're here. You know, and David, when you went for a run earlier today, you know, oxygen got delivered to your quads and your glutes and your hamstrings and your calves and your feet. You know, oxygen got delivered, and then, you know, your heart sucked that blood back to the heart, and it didn't have any oxygen left in it, and then it pushed it over to the lungs, and it's got a bunch of CO2 that it drops off at the lungs, picks up new oxygen, so they could go straight back to your legs and allow you to keep jogging. Takes about a minute for a red blood cell to make its way through your entire body on average. So that's what's happening at the lungs. And that is why this big tube branches smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It is filled with all these alveoli, these little popcorn shaped sacs. And then those popcorn shaped sacs are covered in blood vessels. And what will happen is oxygen, if we sort of look at it, right? Let's say that, you know, this is sort of the wall here. And this is sort of the inside, this is inside the alveoli, and then you've got red blood cells on this side of the wall over here, right? Well, what's going to happen is CO2, which is the sort of the byproduct, right? That's going to leave the red blood cells, and it's going to travel this way into the alveoli. So it's going to go from your blood into the lungs. Meanwhile, oxygen is going to leave the lungs and enter into the red blood cells. And that's the exchange that's happening. That is what we call an external gas exchange. We're going to be talking about that all day today. And so that's happening technically outside your body, right? Like the alveoli are the exposed sort of outside environment that happens to be running inside your body currently, but it's not in your blood, right? It's not like inside between like the walls of your body. It's just kind of in this empty chamber that your body happens to house, right? Again, you guys are all human donuts. And so like, you know, oxygen is being exposed from the outside. This is the atmosphere here, right? And so then it passes through the wall into our red blood cells. Now it's in our body. Meanwhile, CO2 is coming from inside our body and getting exposed back to the atmosphere so you can get rid of it. So that's what's happening here. We need to be able to conduct that in. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about how we drive that massive amount of gas into our lungs, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what we use the term ventilation, right? Ventilation is like, you know, every time I try to cook something and all of a sudden there's smoke filling my kitchen and I open the friggin' window so I can get some fresh air in there. That's ventilation. You know, ventilation is the process of, you know, moving gas, in this case, atmosphere, from one place to another. Now, like I said, the atmosphere that we live in is not really fully oxygen. Composition of air. When we say air, we're not talking about air and oxygen are not quite the same thing. Air is a gas that makes up our atmosphere. And honestly, guys, most of it, about 78% of it, is actually nitrogen. That's the stuff found in protein. So if we ever figure out how to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere, if we ever figure out how to do that, we won't need to eat protein anymore. We can just kind of naturally get it from there. Well, we'd also have to figure out how to make our own amino acids. But anyway, most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Only about 21% of it is oxygen, which is obviously still like a pretty good chunk there. And then a little bit of it is argon, which is kind of fun. A little bit, it's some of the other gases that are there are like neon, the stuff that's in like open signs that makes it kind of glow when you run light through it. That's a gas, actually. That's why neon signs, they're little glass tubes that are filled with gas. And they're filled with neon. Makes really cool colors. And then some of the other gases in there, for instance, are carbon dioxide, because guess what? There's a lot of us people's breathing right there, and that's actually technically like a greenhouse gas. We are, by breathing, sort of contributing to, climate change in our own little way. Carbon dioxide, though, not a very strong greenhouse gas, so it doesn't really have as much of an effect as, say, methane or carbon monoxide. Both those things. Those are the things that your car's spitting out and things that our cows are pooping out. That stuff is a little bit more intense.
Yeah, isn't that why we have? I remember back in the 8th grade, our teacher asked us, "What's the greatest cause for global warming?" And then everybody said, "Oh, it's like cars, right? Like cars." That was the most logical. And our teacher said, "No, it's actually cow farts."
So, all right, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it doesn't have much to do with what we're talking about today, but he's making a good point. Yes, methane is actually, I want to say 10 times. I could be wrong about that number. But it is many, many times more intense of a greenhouse gas than carbon monoxide that we're getting from cars. So it's more intense. And yeah, there's a lot of cows on this planet that are farting out methane. And yes, it's contributing to global warming, sort of. Here's the thing, though. You think about like where the cows are turning grass into methane, right? Because cows eat grass, goes through their digestive tract, becomes methane. But the atmosphere, which created like carbon dioxide, the plants eat carbon dioxide. They eat carbon monoxide, they eat that, right? And that becomes their ingredients. That's sort of like their version of oxygen. Plants fart out oxygen and we breathe it in, So in a weird way, plants are farming us, they need us just as much as we need them. So because that's like kind of a closed system, like the more cows we have, honestly, the more grass we get, and the more grass we have, the more we have cows, right? It's kind of a circle. And so it doesn't actually kind of contribute to, we're not adding anything unnatural. It already kind of exists. Versus when we take oil out of the ground, we take it out of like below the earth, and that is, basically what used to be living organisms. It used to be dinosaurs and, those bugs that I showed you earlier, and they decomposed millions of years and they became oil. And so we take that oil out of that system and then we introduce it to our atmosphere. That was never supposed to happen. That was never, that's like getting a shipment from another planet of carbon dioxide almost, right? Then it screws up the ratios. Whereas the cow thing is kind of accounted for in the natural system. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes
sense. Like imagine your regular bank account, right? And it's like you get paid, you spend money, it's kind of in balance. I mean, hopefully. We just had Christmas. My bank account's all screwed up. But like, like for the most part, like, the money comes in, and then that's the money that I use to buy things. And the money comes in, and then that's the money I use to buy things. But let's say, somebody else, and in this case, like, money's kind of a good thing. So this analogy is kind of backwards, but in this case, money is kind of like the greenhouse gases, and then the spending is kind of like what we use with the living organisms and stuff. And now imagine if, I won the lottery, and, I never entered the lottery, but somebody put my name in, and all of a sudden someone injected from something that I wasn't expecting a ton of cash. Like, now my system's overfilled because it came from an outside source that really was never intended to be there. I should find a way to flip that analogy around, because that actually sounds great. But in this case, we're talking about greenhouse gases, which is not awesome. All right. Anyway, your teacher's right in a way, by the way. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and get back to talking about some biology here. So talking about what ventilation is, right? Let's use the term ventilation. Ventilation is the process of moving gas, in this case, air, which again is mostly nitrogen, but has a lot of oxygen in it, from one place to another, right? So that is what we call, ventilation, right? So ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. So for air to move out of the lungs, for air to leave our lungs, the pressure in the lungs has to be greater than the pressure in the atmosphere here, right? So that happens because our diaphragm squeezes our lungs up. So here's what's fun about like ventilation. If you look at your diaphragm, it's this kind of weird sort of dome-shaped muscle that lives underneath our lungs here in our abdominal cavity, right? And this is a rested position. So this rested position for the diaphragm here is actually pushing on the lungs. It's sort of squeezing them closed. So what that does is now the lungs go from being this big to maybe being this big. And there's the same amount of air, and all of a sudden that air is getting squeezed, and nature is like, holy crap, there's a big concentration of air in here. So what does it do? It rushes out of the lungs. And this is the relaxed position for your diaphragm. That's what's kind of funny, guys. The breathing out is the passive part of breathing. Now you might be thinking, well, what about when I blow out birthday candles and stuff, right? Because obviously we can go, and that's a very active thing to do. But that actually requires secondary muscles in order for that to happen, not just your diaphragm. The breathing in is the active part of breathing. That's you actively contracting your muscles. And what happens is the diaphragm flattens down. Your diaphragm will contract downwards like this. You can see it'll flatten down. And what that does is, because it's attached to your lungs, and because your lungs want to naturally expand, it pulls your lungs open and creates an area of low pressure. So then air comes rushing into the lung. So the diaphragm will naturally sit like this. And when it flattens down, that draws your lungs open. And when it relaxes, that pushes your lungs closed. This brings air in, this pushes air out. So that's sort of how your diaphragm is contracting, and that is the process of ventilation. So for air to move out of the lungs, the pressure in the lungs has to be higher than the pressure in the atmosphere, and that can happen because the diaphragm will relax back to its little dome shape, and that will squeeze the lungs, creating a lack of space. And then that lack of space causes air to go rushing out of the lungs, and that's how you breathe out. And then for air to move into the lungs, the pressure inside the lungs has to be lower than the pressure in the atmosphere. And so the pressure has to be lower in one spot than the other. And then air is going to move to the area of low pressure, because again, nature hates gradients. So it goes from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure naturally. And so this occurs when the diaphragm contracts downward, and that causes the lungs to open up. It causes there to be a lot of big empty space. And nature's like, well, that's gross. I don't like empty space. So it goes to fill it and it drives air into the lungs. So gases and other materials, as a rule of thumb, guys, will always move to the area of low pressure. It'll always go to the area of least resistance, you know? That is sort of ventilation in a nutshell. Now, oftentimes when we are referring to ventilation, we're talking about gas. We're talking about atmosphere moving from one spot to another. Ventilation is air moving from one spot to another. But what about oxygen? What about, that's the whole reason we're even ventilating, right? It's because we're trying to bring in oxygen. We're trying to get rid of CO2. CO2 is the byproduct, right? Well, that's where we have two versions of what we call respiration. Do you guys remember from day one? I mentioned it really briefly. We talked about cellular respiration, right? Cellular respiration is oxygen moving into a cell, and then that cell creates energy and then it spits out CO2. And that happens in every one of your cells, right? That's cellular respiration, bringing oxygen in, spitting out CO2. Well, we also have just regular old respiration that we're talking about when we are talking about breathing, right? That's also respiration. The purpose of ventilation is so that we can experience respiration. Respiration is oxygen moving. So ventilation is gas, right? Air, and air is some oxygen, but also nitrogen and other gases, right? And respiration is oxygen and carbon dioxide. It only refers to those two gases. So there are two versions of respiration that's going to take place. You have got internal respiration and you've got external respiration. So when you hear external respiration, guys, what I want you to picture is external, outside the body. Now, this is taking place in your lungs, but again, your lungs are a part of the atmosphere that happens to be running through your body currently, right? It is the outside world being exposed to the inside world part of you, right? So we're going to kind of take a look at this, right? This is inside the alveoli, and this is red blood cells, right? So red blood cells here are moving oxygen molecules, right? And that's O2. So that's O2, right? And this is carbon dioxide. That's CO2, right? And then, this is sort of the atmosphere is in here. We'll put that in sort of a sky blue. It's a little too sky blue. So there's the atmosphere, right? That's where, actually, what? Let's put this up here. That's where this is happening. So that's inside the alveoli. They're being exposed to the atmosphere, right? Whereas this side is, this is inside our body. Right? So that's the wall, right? That's what the wall is sort of separating. It's separating the outside environment from the inside environment. And so we're able to move things here. So you would have just some empty space here, and then this would be absolutely filled with little red blood cells, right? There'd be all these little red blood cells in here. And so that's where we're moving it, right? And so those red blood cells are here to sort of drop off their CO2 that they happen to be carrying currently, right? And so they're getting rid of their CO2 and they are picking up their oxygen, right? And that happens at the lungs. And this is the exposure to the outside, right, from the inside. That is why we call this whole process, this whole thing is an example of what we call external respiration. Okay, so external respiration is taking place in the lungs, right? Actually, I'll put that up here. And so external respiration is taking place at the lungs. Technically, this is outside your body, right? Now, let's totally divide this down. You know, my little chart here. And let's take a look at what internal respiration is. So we're going to draw kind of the same thing here. You know, we'll kind of go like this. And now we're going to see that this is our red blood cells on this side. And then over here, we'll say this is inside a body cell. Okay, so this is just sort of the inside of some cell in your body, right? That could be a muscle cell, it could be a skin cell, it could be a neuron, you know, bone cell, whatever, right? This is inside the body here, right? So we'll put that. Actually, you know what? Hang on, let me relabel this. I'm gonna say this is a body cell. Wrong color. Okay, so this is the body cell, and there's our red blood cell, right? So this is what's going to happen here is we're going to have all these little red blood cells. Right, draw some of these real quick. Right, give them their little donut shape. And what's going to happen is the exact opposite. This is internal respiration. Okay, and this is happening at the body's tissues. So this is happening on a tissue level here on this side, right? So what's going to happen is literally exactly the opposite. Your cells just got finished producing energy. So what's going to happen is they are going to spit out carbon dioxide, or again, CO2, and they're going to spit out that carbon dioxide from the cell, and it's going to go over into the red blood cell. It's going to pass through the walls between that body tissue and, you know, the capillary. And then the exact opposite, your cells, your red blood cells, their whole job was to deliver oxygen over here. So now oxygen is on this side. Or O2 is over here, and it is going to move this way, right? It's going to go across onto this side. So that's what we're seeing, right? External gas exchange is dropping off CO2 and picking up oxygen. Internal gas exchange is dropping off CO2 and dropping off oxygen and picking up CO2. Okay, that's what your red blood cells are doing there, right? And so again, we see sort of the exchange here, right? Oxygen's going to go this way, and CO2 is going to go this way. And then this red blood cell we look at right here, it's going to work its way over here, back to the lungs, thanks to your heart pumping it around. And the exact opposite, all that CO2 that this one just picked up, right? It's going to go over here, and it's going to spit it out of your lungs. Okay, that is respiration. And there is external respiration taking place at the lungs because it's external, and internal respiration taking place at your body's tissues, at your body's cells, right? So external gas exchange is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the atmosphere. Oxygen enters the bloodstream, CO2 exits the bloodstream. This takes place at the lungs. Internal gas exchange is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the tissues in the body and the blood, tissues of the body and the blood. And oxygen exits the bloodstream and enters the cells, the tissues, and CO2 exits the cells and tissues into the red blood cell. This takes place at a tissue level. And that is how you are constantly, you know, getting oxygen from over there, you know, here in the atmosphere, and getting it delivered to, you know, your brain, as I shove it full of anatomy information. You know, that's how you get it to the neurons that are kind of processing everything we're talking about today. Any questions on that? Is everybody pretty clear on the direction that these gases are moving? Anybody have any questions?
No, we good.
Feeling good? Love that. All right. Cool. So now let's kind of go back to the whole ventilation thing, right? So ventilation is, again, breathing, right? Breathing is driving gas, air, all those different gases into our lungs, right? So you got inspiration. That's the process of breathing in, right? And that's the contraction of the diaphragm. So again, your diaphragm is this big dome-shaped muscle, right? It's a dome-shaped muscle that relaxes. And when it relaxes, it drives air out of the lungs, or it contracts and flattens down to drive air into the lungs, right? So your diaphragm is the primary muscle responsible for breathing. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our diaphragms healthy and functioning. Here's the thing, guys. Anybody in this call right now, does anybody ever get tension headaches? Headaches at the back of your head? Anybody? Love that. That's a good answer, actually.
My mom does.
Oh, yeah? Does
Yeah.
your mom have a posture that is a little bit kind of like this? A little bit elevated and maybe a little rounded?
Not that I know of.
No? She doesn't look like a little tense? So here's the thing. Often people who get tension headaches, the ones in the back of the head in particular, they are using breathing muscles that they're really not supposed to be using. It's not that you're not supposed to use them at all. Like you wouldn't be able to use them if you weren't ever supposed to use them. But like, you know, David went for a run earlier and had to use extra breathing muscles in order to make that happen. Because like, you know, it's an elevated situation where he's breathing a little bit harder than he necessarily, you know, would if you were just sitting around, right? That's what exercise does. But when we get stressed out, when, you know, we got a deadline or we forgot to text somebody back and somebody's mad at us, you know, like when we're stressed out and we're breathing like this, like, see how I'm like using my shoulders here? I'm using secondary respiratory muscles that are really great for helping me if I'm like really super out of breath. Yeah, great. Use your secondary helper muscles. But a lot of people will use those muscles when they're not supposed to. Their body thinks that they're fighting like a bear or something, you know? They think that they're running from some crazy animal because they're so stressed out. They wouldn't be stressed out unless they were fighting an animal, right? And that's like, well, you know, biology existed before taxes, you know? It's like April 15th and you're like, oh God, I gotta get these things filed. You know, unfortunately, your body doesn't know the difference between, you know, your girlfriend texting you, you know, hey, did you remember it's our anniversary today? And fighting a bear. You know, it doesn't really know the difference between those two things. They are both equally stressful. And so what ends up happening is you use these extra sort of fighting muscles, you know, to breathe in. And when you use those all days, here's the problem with that. Those muscles are also postural muscles. They also affect your skeletal system. So when you use those, you know what ends up happening? You end up with overactive muscles that kind of keep your shoulders elevated like this. And now when you try to raise your arms overhead, you can't quite get them all the way up there, because in order to get your shoulders, your arms to raise all the way up, they need to be in a relaxed position. Your shoulder joint can't move properly if you don't breathe properly. You get shoulder impingement, you get shoulder problems, you get a clicking in your shoulder. That's probably due to you breathing the wrong way, or at least relaxing and sitting in your posture the wrong way. This is one of the reasons why it's so important for us. You know, we're personal trainers, right? We're all about posture. We're all about moving through the correct ranges of motions without getting hurt, right? That's our whole job. So we need to understand this breathing process, obviously, to understand having enough energy to get through our workout. And that's really what we're talking about here in our exercise physiology class. But some of you guys have gone through my fitness assessment classes. Some of you guys have been through kinesiology with me. And those upper trapezius, levator scapula, sternocleidomastoid, pec minor muscles, all of those muscles will start being used for breathing, and it screws up our posture. And that's one of the reasons why we need to learn how to relax. We need to learn how to, let go of all of our tension and sort of relax here, and get to a place of healthy breathing again, and use our diaphragm, which is supposed to be the primary muscle for breathing. Learn how to breathe into our stomach. I know it makes our stomach pooch out, and that's not everybody's favorite feeling in the world, but that is how we are supposed to breathe. That is how we're meant to breathe. Send your breath as low as you can, because that is going to allow us to breathe properly. So when we're talking about these pressure changes, right? Inspiration is driving air into the lungs. Your diaphragm flattens down. Expiration is pushing air out of the lungs, and that is where your diaphragm relaxes. So during inspiration, the volume increases, which creates an area of low pressure, and that's why air rushes into the lungs. During expiration, the diaphragm flattens, creating a squeezing sensation on your lungs, which pushes it out. This is also what you'll see sometimes. You ever see like a stoke? I can't remember what they're actually called. Fire stoke. Stoker, is that literally what they're called? Yeah. You ever see these like in old timey movies? They got fire stokers. They're those little, that's a fire poker. Bellows, that's what they're called. They're called a bellows. They're these little things, right? And it's this little, like, that's kind of like your lungs, right? You grab the little wood parts, you open it up like this, right? And that draws air in through these three little holes right here. And then you push it closed like that. And that's actually going to drive air out of those holes. But the hole over here is much bigger. So what ends up happening is that pushes air out here. And you put that into your fire and you go like this, and it makes air enter, and then the fire gets bigger. And that way you don't have to put your face in there and go, which is what I would always do when I was a little kid, and, inevitably get smoke in my eyes and start crying. Because we had a wood stove when I was growing up. Or if you're ever doing like a campfire, and you're having trouble getting your fire going, you get down low, you go, right? You add more oxygen to the whole thing. So that's sort of the process of breathing or ventilation, right? Inspiration driving air in, expiration driving air out. Now, all of us in this call, we're all going to have ever so slightly different lung volumes based on, our physical conditioning. If you exercise a lot, guess what? Your diaphragm is going to get really strong. Your intercostal muscles, the muscles between your ribs that also help with breathing, they're going to get really strong, right? So chances are you'll be able to drive in more gas than somebody who's never exercised before. Your age has to do with this. As we get older, our posture changes, our muscles get maybe a little bit weaker, right? And so you might not be able to draw in as much lung. Your gender, guys, you're going to be a little bit larger. You're probably going to have larger lungs. Your body size, all of those things are going to be factors that have to do with your lung capacities. You ever hear about somebody who has sleep apnea? So sleep apnea is where someone will be sleeping and all of a sudden they'll just stop breathing in the middle of the night. It's heavily associated with clients who are, extremely obese. It can also be a hormonal thing. So if you have sleep apnea and you're like, I'm not obese, yeah, that's probably true. But it can even happen to bodybuilders sometimes, really super strong individuals who have a lot of muscle mass. And what'll happen is their body will relax enough because they're asleep, that their muscles can't contract hard enough to drive air into the lungs and expand the diaphragm and thoracic cavity. They can't expand it. So what happens is they'll be breathing and then they won't take a breath in. And like, it's scary when when you hear somebody with sleep apnea, just stop breathing in the middle of the night. And then all of a sudden their body really needs oxygen. So it starts to wake up and they go, and it wakes them up. And so then all of a sudden they're awake and then they don't get enough sleep. And then their body starts creating stress hormones, and sleep apnea is a really, frustrating disease and makes it harder to lose weight because now their body is filled with stress hormones, and part of the problem is that they're already overweight, and it's a really vicious cycle. And that's why they'll sleep with what's called a CPAP machine. And they'll often sleep with this mask on, and that mask will help them maintain breathing while they're sleeping, and it looks very uncomfortable, you know, but it keeps them asleep all night, which is really obviously very important. So very common in obese individuals. Often sleep apnea is a very, very, very common thing that you'll see. So again, body size is going to determine how much air you can drive in, you know. If you've got a heavy body, it's going to be harder for you to expand your ribs. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about these lung volumes here. Now, for the record, this is probably something you guys won't be tested on, but they keep putting it in materials. I've never once seen a question. I mean, I've seen homework questions, but I've never heard of anybody seeing this on their actual NASM test. So pay attention. It's going to help you pass your Sochi homeworks. But you're probably, if I'm being perfectly transparent here, you're probably not going to see this on your test. But there are different lung volumes. Okay. So when we look at our lung volumes, it kind of works like this, right? Oh, thank you, internet. That's exactly what I wanted. Oh, that's really low res. Hold on. There we go. So this is sort of how your lung volumes work, right? So what you've got is what is known as your regular tidal volume. See this little volume right here? It's like, imagine if this right here, this is like the biggest amount you can breathe in, right? So imagine if you go like this, right? You try to breathe in as much air as possible. You know, if a doctor was asking you to do that and they measured how much air was rushing into your lungs right there, that would be what is known as your inspiratory, you're breathing in, right? Inspiration, reserve volume. Okay, it's all the volume beyond a normal breath to your absolute maximum. Now imagine if you go like this. You got nothing left, right? Like, and you breathe all the air possible out of your lungs. That is your expiratory reserve volume. Now, here's what's kind of funny. There's still a little bit of volume left. Even if I try to breathe out as hard as I can, there's a little bit left. It's kind of like crumpling up a sack. There's got to be at least a little space left in there, unless you're really just plunging it down, right? And that would be what's known as your residual volume. If you ever tap into that, you have collapsed one of your lungs, and that's not awesome. Don't do that. So that is the biggest amount in and the biggest amount out. That is called your vital capacity. If you were breathing like you're using your vital capacity. Now we don't really do that. We don't really tap into that very often. Alexi, is your son listening? Like, who is this guy?
No, my son is doing the same thing and he's laughing at the same time. That's why I'm laughing.
I'm sure. All of a sudden, you guys just see me like, you know. So that's your vital capacity. That's the most to the very little. We don't really use that very often. Like, you guys are all just kind of sitting around right now, right? You're not really doing much physically, right? Some of you might be standing. I don't know if anybody's at the gym right now. That sometimes happens. So, you know, looking at you, Edwin. On the going down the slopes, or looking at you, Chris. I've seen you in the gym before, but you know, chances are you're not breathing that hard right now, you know. So normally you guys are probably just normally breathing. That is called your tidal volume. Imagine if you were asleep right now, right? You're just asleep and it just kind of sounds like the tide coming in and the tide going out, right? You know, gently in, gently out. That is what we call your tidal volume. So those are all the volumes of our lungs, right? Your lung volumes are the different volumes of air, and that's just the gas with everything, associated with the different phases of a respiration cycle. You've got tidal volume, which is normal, quiet breathing, right? That's normal patterns in. It kind of sounds like the tide. You've got your inspiratory reserve, which is all of the air between, like, let's say you take a normal breath in It's all of that stuff that's left, right? It's all the volume, that's the amount of space left for a breath in after tidal volume. And then there's your expiratory reserve. So you take a normal breath out, and then all of that's left over afterwards. That's the maximal amount that can be expelled after a normal breath out. And then there's your vital capacity, which is biggest in and biggest out. That's your vital capacity. There is also, like I said, the residual volume, and that's the amount of air that's left beyond like a maximum exhalation. There's just a little bit of empty space there. If you ever tap into that, your lung collapsed. Don't do that. So you'll hear people, tap into that. David, you'll hear that sometimes happen with MMA fighters or boxers. If they ever get hit just right, sometimes it can actually cause a lung to collapse. And that's not awesome. They gotta go in there and fill it back up.
But that's like the same thing for getting knocked out, right? Everybody claims to have an iron chin. You can have an iron chin, but if somebody gets you at the right angle, if they get it just right, anybody is going out, like kind of that thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So so that is sort of the different volumes of lungs as we're looking at it, right? And then there's a term that we're going to use. It's called your minute ventilation. So your minute ventilation, it's kind of like the function of your heart. One of the things we're going to look at tomorrow that's really important. There's two things that make up the function of your heart, guys. There is your heart rate. Like that's the rhythm of your heart, right? And then it's what's called your stroke volume. That's how much blood gets pumped every time your heart beats. Right? So it's like it's how much blood every time your heart like squeezes, how much blood's leaving your heart. If your heart's really strong, it's like, imagine if all of us had a contest where we all each had a bottle of water. And take the lid off, and we're going to see who can squirt that water the farthest. Right? You're not allowed to move your arm. The only thing you're allowed to do, squeeze it as hard as you can. Whoever in here has the strongest grip, that water is going to go flying. And whoever's got the weakest grip, it's just kind of gently going to exit the bottle. That's how your heart works. The stronger your heart is, the farther it's able to squeeze, the more blood it's able to eject. That's your stroke volume. So the overall function of your heart are those things multiplied together. How much blood is being ejected per beat and how many beats are happening per minute. So the same thing is true of minute ventilation. That is the overall function of your lungs, right? It's the volume of air expired per minute. That is the product of your volume of air that you can drive into your lungs and the frequency of breath. How often you can breathe, that's kind of like your heart rate. And the volume of air that kind of comes in, that is your sort of stroke volume of the lungs, right? So that's one of the ways that we can tell how good a shape someone is in cardiovascularly. We start to measure what is called their VO2 max, or maximum volume of O2, right? So your VO2 max, that's the most oxygen you can bring in. Now, obviously, that is going to be affected by how big your lungs are and how much air you can drive into your lungs. Yes, absolutely. But here's the thing. It is also determined by how much on a cellular level your cells can drive in oxygen and use that oxygen. So remember, on the first day, I mentioned really briefly, oxygen goes into a cell and it goes straight to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are where you use oxygen plus all the byproducts of glucose and stuff to spit out a bunch of energy. Well, the more mitochondria you guys have, the more oxygen is going to diffuse into your blood cells. That's kind of the dirty secret. Like today I've been talking about, at your lungs, oxygen kind of, air molecules get exposed and they get picked up by your red blood cells and they get carried to wherever it is they're going, right? But here's the thing. It makes it sound as if all the oxygen comes in, goes into your blood, and all the air that comes out is pure CO2. That's not really true. In fact, you guys are all, for the most part, at rest right now. I'm sitting down, I'm a little animated because I'm talking and stuff. But for the most part, like, we're just sitting here. So you know what? Only about 70% of the oxygen that I bring in actually gets used. The remaining 30% just gets exhaled again. I don't use it, right? Now, if I were sprinting right now as hard as I can, and I'm like, and I'm just going hard as possible right now, I would be driving in 100% of the oxygen. All the oxygen molecules that go in, they all go into my blood. None of it doesn't get used because my cells are hungry for as much oxygen as possible. So now let's say we got two people and both of those people are running as hard as they can. They're the same age, they're the same body weight, right? They're the same height, they're the same everything, right? Identical to one another. And both of those people are sprinting as hard as they are able. They are both using 100% of as much oxygen as they bring in. But person A, they train for marathons, they train for sprinting. They're a cardio monster, and person B, they've never exercised a day in their life. Well, because of the years of training, person A, their muscles have more mitochondria in them. Their muscle cells are probably a little bigger. They probably have more muscle cells. So they have more things internally that eat oxygen. They have more stuff. And their body has made more enzymes in order to utilize and kick off these oxygen reactions that I've been talking about all day. Remember, enzymes kick off chemical reactions, right? They got more cardiovascular enzymes, right? And they are so used to contracting their diaphragm's really strong. So they're able to really expand their lungs. Person B, they've never trained before. Their muscles don't have very much mitochondria. They don't have very many muscle cells. They don't have a very strong diaphragm in comparison to person A. So person A is going to have a bigger volume of oxygen entering and exiting compared with person B. They have a higher VO2 max. And that's why the VO2 max, guys, is the best way to tell who's in really good shape. So you guys can go get a VO2 max test. Now, obviously, we do some of you guys might remember the Rockport walk test that we do in the gym, right? We make a client walk a mile. Chris, I know you definitely remember the Rockport walk test. But it's where, you are walking for a mile, and it can estimate with a little bit of fancy math based on how fast you walk the mile and what your heart rate is. It can estimate what your VO2 max is. So it's a good way to kind of test yourself and see if it's improving as you're training. But if you really want to get a really good VO2 max test, go and wear one of these breathing tubes, and a personal trainer or doctor or whatever, they'll make you run as fast as you can. And they'll get you fully as out of breath as you can possibly get. And you wear this mask, and that mask is going to tell how much carbon dioxide is leaving and how much oxygen is entering. And it will tell you what your volume of oxygen that you are consuming at max is. And that's what your VO2 max is. That's the best way to tell how good a shape you're in cardiovascular wise. Doesn't have anything to do with lifting weights or anything, but it does tell you who is a monster cardio athlete. If you can consume about 40 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight, you're in great shape. That's where we want you. But pro athletes meaning like cyclists and marathon runners and stuff, they'll sometimes get their VO2 max up to like 80. I've even seen 100. I wonder, actually, hold on. What is the highest ever recorded VO2 max? 96, yeah, close to 100. God, that's crazy. I was a cross-country skier. That's wild. Anyway, 40 is amazing. 96 is, that guy probably, honestly, was probably like Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong, big cheater for the record, but his body, actually, his heart was about 20% larger, and all of his blood vessels were a little bit larger than the average person's, which is part of the reason why he was such an exceptional athlete. And that was before all the, cheating. So let's go ahead and look at gas exchange inside the body. So we've talked a lot today. So far, we spent most of our time talking about this external gas exchange. It's at the lungs, right? You drop off your CO2, you pick up your oxygen. Well, at the body tissue level, right, you're going to have, actually, this is both of them. So at your lungs, right, your gas exchange is going to happen between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, right? So remember, your pulmonary capillaries are taking place at your lungs. So your lungs end in these little popcorn sacs, and they're covered in blood vessels. And so these blue sections, that's where CO2 is getting dropped off, and these red sections, that's where O2 or oxygen is entering, right? So that's what happens at the lungs, right? Pulmonary capillaries are microscopic blood vessels that form beds that cover your alveoli. Oxygen goes from the lungs into the blood cells. CO2 goes from the blood cells into the lungs. Now, at a tissue level, the exact opposite happens, right? Your blood cells are going to drop off the oxygen to keep your tissues alive, and they're going to pick up CO2 because your tissues just got done producing energy before that blood cell, got there, right? So it picks up any of the CO2 byproducts there. Now, all day today, we've been talking about these red blood cells carrying all this stuff. How the heck do they do that? Why does oxygen go this way and CO2 go that way? Well, that is thanks to a really cool specialized protein found within your red blood cells. So, Edwin, we were talking about blue blood earlier, right? So here we go. So here's how I know your blood is always red, because your red blood cells have this protein in it called hemoglobin. You guys probably heard of hemoglobin. Doctors will do a hemoglobin test every now and then if they have somebody who's breathing poorly. Joseph, I guarantee your doctors did a hemoglobin test.
It was really high. I had to go do a full blood donation.
Yeah. I mean, you were a runner, so they were probably like, oh, he's got plenty of hemoglobin. Why the heck can't he breathe? COVID. But yeah, that's what a hemoglobin is. It is a protein that exists in your red blood cells. So go back to our example of the two runners. Person A, who exercises all the time, he probably has just the same amount of red blood cells as the other person. Their body weight's the same, their height's the same, right? Probably has the same amount of blood, same number of red blood cells, but his red blood cells probably have more hemoglobin in them because he trains consistently for cardio. So the enzymes in his blood are like, holy crap, we need more. We need to be really good at delivering oxygen. So it makes more hemoglobin proteins. So hemoglobin is a protein. Now, that protein has a molecule of iron at the center of it. So red blood cells are saturated with hemoglobin proteins, which is why red blood cells are responsible for carrying oxygen. Because guess what? Iron and oxygen are buddy-buddy. They love each other. Iron and oxygen love to bind together. And you guys have definitely seen that happen before if you've ever seen something rust out. What happens when oxygen binds to iron? It turns a bright red color. Iron and oxygen turn bright red, and that is why your red blood cells are red. For the record, it's also why Mars is red. How crazy is that? There's a ton of iron in Mars's soil, tons of it. That's why it's the red planet. There is a ton of iron, and when iron and oxygen bind together, it turns a bright red color. That's why your red blood cells are red, and that's why I know you don't have blue blood, because in order for something to turn blue, you don't need iron to attach to it, you need copper. So the Statue of Liberty, well, that's not giving me what I want. There we go. The Statue of Liberty is, bluish green, right? No, it's made out of some bluish green metal. No, it's not. It's made out of copper. Here's the original color. It used to look like this, right? But it's been sitting there and it's exposed to oxygen. So it has oxygenated and all the copper has turned this kind of bluish color. Now, there are animals on the planet that have blue blood. In fact, Patrick from SpongeBob probably has blue blood. I mean, they're not going to show that on, TV, but that's a kid's cartoon. But like starfish actually use copper to bind oxygen and deliver it around their body. They don't use iron the way we do. And I can't remember what it's called, but it's not called cyoglobin, but if I type that in, maybe I'll find it. Cyano, is that what it is? Anyway, certain squids and certain spiders, actually, some octopuses that are out there, they use copper to bind to oxygen and travel around our body. So that's why they will hemocyanin. Good Lord, that's hard to say. That's why their blood is actually bluish. There's green out there. There's certain types of worms and stuff that have green blood. That's really similar to, that's actually why plants are green, because of chloroform. They have chloro something sign. And then there's even purple blood out there. So there's a lot of kind of different colors of blood out there, which is kind of weird. And it's because they use different metals. They use different molecules to bind to them. We use iron. And that's why we know our red blood is always red. So red blood cells are saturated with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has iron in it, and that is how it attracts oxygen. Now, for the record, you can actually trick your body into making extra hemoglobin. Fun fact, if you go to like high elevation, if you go hike Mount Everest, right? Give me a chart, come on. There we go. There's the picture I always look up. So let's say you climb up a mountain, right? You go up to Mount Everest. Now at Everest, what's kind of funny is like, you'll see people carry oxygen tanks with them. And that's because the composition, the air, they say the air is much thinner up there. Here's what's funny. The amount of air is actually the same. Air is kind of similar. The concentration's always about 21% oxygen and about 70% or 78% nitrogen. That's the same on Mount Everest as it is at sea level. But the number of molecules of each is less. So the ratio remains the same, but the concentration is much lower. Now, this is one of the reasons why. Has anybody in here ever worn one of those elevation masks?
I've tried one.
So here's what kind of sucks about that. I don't want to ruin this for you entirely, but scientifically, people will say, oh, it's like running at high elevation. Your body will make more hemoglobin in response, because that's what happens when you go up here. When you go up here, your body will go, holy crap, we are not bringing in very many oxygen molecules. We need more hemoglobin so that we can attract oxygen better. And that's what will happen. Your body will make more red blood cells. It'll make more hemoglobin in those red blood cells. And then your body becomes an oxygen attracting magnet, So people will wear these masks. Now, what these masks do is all they do is reduce the amount of oxygen coming in, but you're still at sea level. So the concentration of oxygen is the same. Unfortunately, biologically, your body does not make any more hemoglobin. It kind of just stays the same, which is kind of a bummer, Oh, we lost our new guy. We lost Simon. So unfortunately, it doesn't. Now, I'm not saying it won't help you with cardio. Like if you wear those things, it's really difficult to get oxygen in. And it's really good for mental toughness. It can really be really good to teach you how to breathe properly and use your actual diaphragm instead of your secondary respiratory muscles. There are benefits to these training masks, but when you hear trainers say it's going to make you have more hemoglobin, it's going to make your body better at diffusing oxygen, it doesn't do that, unfortunately, because the concentration of atmosphere is the same in both places. If you want to experience increased hemoglobin, hang out in Denver, Colorado for a couple days, the Mile High City, right? So go to a high elevation, hang out there, and then go run a race the next day at a low elevation. That will actually help you be a much better runner. So that is the hemoglobin saturation. Now, that's hemoglobin. Hemoglobin exists in your red blood cells. Now, there is another protein that's also responsible for carrying oxygen. That's called myoglobin. Myoglobin, super, super, super similar to hemoglobin. But heme comes from the word that actually means iron. And myo comes from the word that means muscle. And globin means oxygen. So iron is in your blood. That's heme. Right? So hemoglobin is blood oxygen. Myoglobin is muscle oxygen. So this is a protein that's really similar, that is binding to oxygen molecules. This is how oxygen gets delivered throughout all of your muscles, because your capillaries only cover so much of your muscle tissue, and you need to be able to get it from the blood capillary, maybe over there, and so that's where myoglobin is. So hemoglobin from a red blood cell will drop off oxygen to myoglobin, and then myoglobin will carry it to the muscle cell wherever it needs to go. When you buy a steak and it's got like, it's got that little bit of red juice coming out of it. A lot of people are like, oh God, that's a bloody steak, right? They see all this stuff and it's like, that's a bloody steak. Actually, no, it's not. When they butcher an animal, they drain it of all of its blood. There's no blood left in it. What you're seeing here is myoglobin, which is really similar to blood, but this is mostly like plasma, water, and a little bit of oxygen binding to that myoglobin protein, which is what's giving it that red color. There's actually no blood left in anything that you buy when you're at the supermarket. It just kind of looks the same as blood. So we think it's blood. But have you ever seen blood be that watery? Definitely not. It just happens to share the same color. That's why it's myoglobin. So there's another fun fact that you can use at dinner next time you go to a steakhouse. So myoglobin is a protein in muscle fibers that binds to oxygen so that it can deliver it to the mitochondria of our cells and allow that to produce a bunch of energy. So here's the thing. We've got two different muscle fiber types. We will be talking about that in a few days. You guys probably have heard about, some of you guys have talked about this before. But you probably heard about the difference between type 1 muscle fibers and type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers are the big fibers. Type 1 are like the long, lean fibers, right? If I look up type 1 muscle versus type 2 muscle, if I look this up, it'll probably pull up a picture of like a marathon runner versus like a bodybuilder. I mean, it is, but they're all drawings. All right, whatever. We'll look at it right here. So type 2 is what we know as fast twitch, right? You can see this guy here, big muscular dude, right? That's a sprinter. And then over here, long, lean, still muscular, but like a different type of muscle. This is our slow twitch type 1. This is our fast twitch type 2. So type 2 fibers primarily rely on glycolysis, the beginning part of the energy system that produces energy really fast, but has a limited capacity. So they're really strong, but they don't have as much endurance. Person over here, not quite as strong. The muscles are much smaller, but they are very aerobic. They rely on producing energy in the mitochondria. So they do not fatigue very fast. So a type 1 slow twitch athlete would probably have a higher amount of myoglobin. They would probably have more hemoglobin in their blood, which would make them better at utilizing oxygen. That's what you want in an endurance cardio-based athlete. Whereas a bodybuilder, we want to focus more on type 2 muscle fibers. And that is the beginning of what we're talking about. When I said on the first day, I was like, we're going to understand the difference between 6 to 12 repetitions and 12 to 20 repetitions. 12 to 20 would make type 1 muscle fibers that would rely on hemoglobin, myoglobin, and mitochondria for energy production. Type 6 to 12 reps would rely much more on glycolysis and large cells with lots of fluid in them for energy production. to make big, powerful contractions. This is where cardio and strength training sort of understand each other as being a little bit of a physiologically different process for each. So last thing I want to talk about, which isn't in your notes here, just kind of wrapping up the PowerPoint here. Carbon dioxide is also going to be transported by your red blood cells. That is also going to happen thanks to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin can carry carbon as well because there is a little bit of oxygen. It's carbon dioxide, right? So it is also pretty good, but there's also some of that carbon dioxide is going to dissolve in your blood. That's why we call it plasma instead of just calling it straight blood. And so some of it will diffuse and some of it will become bicarbonate, which is one oxygen molecule with 2 bits of carbon attached to it. And so all of that's going to kind of move. We call that carb, it's so hard to say, carb amino hemoglobin at that point, but it's when carbon dioxide attaches to hemoglobin. Very, very, very similar. And when it gets to the lungs, it becomes very attracted to the atmosphere, which is why carbon dioxide leaves the red blood cells and enters the lungs, and oxygen enters red blood cells. So here's what's fun about the breathing process. Remember, nature is kind of a socialist, right? Doesn't like it when there's a lot of this over here, very little of this over here. So if we go back to our chart, inside the alveoli, that's a very oxygen-rich environment. There is a ton of oxygen over here, which is why nature goes, blah, move that oxygen over this way. So it moves, that's why it moves into your red blood cells. And inside your red blood cells, there's a lot of CO2 currently. And there's very little CO2 in the lungs. Because remember, in the atmosphere, it's only like 1% CO2, right? Versus like 20% oxygen. So nature goes, oh God. And so it drives the CO2 out because of the difference of concentration and because of the differences in pressure. And the exact opposite thing happens at your body tissue level. So other things that you'll sometimes hear people talk about, you'll sometimes hear what's known as a diffusing capacity. That's basically how fast this can happen. Again, the more enzymes you have, it's a chemical reaction, right? More enzymes you've got, the faster diffusing capacity you have. The more cardio you do, the better you're going to be at moving these gases around. That, by the way, is part of why, like, you might feel like you lose your cardio pretty quickly. Like, I have only taken like 2 weeks off from playing Ultimate, but I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be sucking air today. I'm going to feel like I'm really out of breath in about 90 minutes. And that's because, you know, your enzymes, they just don't live very long. They die really fast, and I haven't been using them. So because I haven't been going for very much, I mean, my girlfriend did a couple hikes, but that didn't really count, you know. And so what's going to happen is I just don't have quite as many enzymes right now. So my body will have to make those in response to today's workout, tomorrow's workout, the next day's workout, and then Saturday I'm gonna be Ultimate again. We'll make more there, and then chances are I'm gonna feel fine. It really only takes about a week for it to come back, but it does only take about a week for them to die as well. And that's why it feels like you lose your cardio so fast. You know, when it comes to strength training, it kind of feels like you maintain muscle mass. You know, it's like you might feel a little worse, might feel a little more out of breath when you go back to the gym after a little break. But for the most part, your 1 rep max doesn't change that much. But your cardio, it feels like you lost it all very quickly. That's the enzymes, okay? There's also transmit time. Transmit time is the time required for cells to move into the capillary. That has to do with the pressure in your heart. So depending on how strong your heart is, it's going to transport blood a little bit more slowly or maybe a little bit more quickly. And so tomorrow, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about oxygen delivery and cardiac output. Cardiac output is the overall function of your heart. Like I said, it's the stroke volume, which is how much blood is pumped per beat, times the heart rate, which is how often it's beating. Those two things come together. You could be driving in a lot of oxygen, but if your heart can't deliver it very quickly, you're going to gum up the works and you're not going to be so good at cardio. And that's okay, because we can always train for it, but that's what we're going to spend our time talking about tomorrow. And then there's also oxygen utilization, which is where your VO2 max comes in. The more oxygen you can use, guys, the more air your cells are hungry for, the more air your cells can eat. Well, the more oxygen your cells can eat, I shouldn't say air. The higher VO2 max you have. It's the volume of oxygen consumed. So the more stuff you've got, the more you can consume. Kind of like if you had a bigger stomach, you'd be able to eat more food. So that is lungs in a nutshell. So we are getting into the final bits. We're starting to get out of energy ingredients, right? Yesterday we talked about ingredients. We talked about getting glucose and fat and protein and stuff in our digestive system. Today we talked about the ingredient oxygen. Those are the two things necessary for energy production, but we do need to take a little pit stop before we actually get into the energy production. We got to talk about how we deliver all this stuff, because both the glucose, the fats, the protein, all that stuff's going to get delivered thanks to your cardiovascular system. Oxygen is going to get delivered thanks to your cardiovascular system, right? So we got to talk about that tomorrow. We're talking about the delivery tomorrow, and transportation of all of these nutrients that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. And then on Friday, we will get into the actual energy production. We'll talk more about ATP again. So, questions, comments, concerns, how are all y'all feeling?
Good.
I'm good.
Good. Question is, are we gonna meet up for what is it, for the 6th of January?
Is that Monday? No, we're not meeting. 6th of January is tomorrow.
It's Wednesday, no?
We're meeting up on the 10th, Monday.
Oh, Monday?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what? We meet on the 6th day of class. That might be what you're thinking of. We meet on day 6, which is Monday the 10th.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That
we
was
meet on,
actually 6th
yeah.
of January.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
No,
so it's
we
the
meet
10th.
on day 6 and we meet on day 12. That will be the 10th of January and the 19th of January.
Okay.
I guess the only question I have is there like, do you recommend any books you should read on this? Like, is there like a
So
book?
this stuff will come in handy if you guys want to do a little bit of reading in your textbook. Go to your NASM.
Well, I mean, there's
Chapter-
a textbook, but I was wondering, is there like a whole book or just like something like this?
Oh,
like,
for cardio? Yeah, there's a lot of them out there.
any you recommend?
Not any that are not textbooks, you know?
Okay. Yeah, I get
And
it.
honestly, like you'd buy a whole textbook and then it wouldn't, you know, you'd read 2 chapters of it. Your Memler's textbook that we're going to use next module, we'll use it in about 6 weeks. That'll have some really good chapters. But for now, if you guys want to read chapter 3.
And you said chapter 17 too, right? That one?
Well, that's for the nutrition.
Right.
Chapter 3 will do the nutrition. If you want to know the cardio stuff, read the first half of chapter 3.
Okay.
First half of chapter 3 in the book with the girl doing the push-up in the pink shirt.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool.